All right, so this is my persuasive speech on anti-gun laws. My name is Luke O'Branson, and this is for Flex CTA 103. And this is my friend Max, one of my good friends that we talk and play all the time on online and all that fun stuff. Max, really quick before we start, would you please tell us your position on gun laws?
I'd say I'm relatively in the middle.
Yeah.
I see arguments from both sides. There's people who obviously have guns for protective reasoning, there's
Mm-hmm.
enshrinements in the Constitution, but on the other token, there's a lot of gun violence in the country,
Mm-hmm.
means of getting it illegally, um, leading to lots of homicide. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think I saw a statistic that the number one killer of children in this country is guns,
Mm-hmm.
and that's an alarming statistic.
That's true.
Um, so I'd say relatively in the middle because I am a gun owner myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I do certainly understand both sides.
Yeah.
So not really leaning either way.
Well, thankfully, this I am going to bring up similar to that. We are going to have counterpoints and such later, but pretty much the specific purpose of this is to persuade my audience or an audience that stricter gun laws may not quite be the solution. And it isn't quite the solution of violence in America. And protecting the right to own firearms is essential for, in my opinion, personal safety, liberty, and effectively crime prevention. After that, we're going to talk about the central idea. That's pretty much stricter gun laws penalize law abiding citizens, and they do not effectively reduce crime. And they undermine the fundamental right, the Second Amendment, which is considered vital for self defense and safeguarded freedom. And so, with that, you said, you're kind of in the middle. Completely get that. I will say, quite later, I am a little proud of my assessing the counter arguments later. I like to think I did decent on that. We'll get to that, though. So, imagine being home alone and someone breaks in, right? Like, this is the most traditional, classic thing that you see. But the police are either minutes or, quite frankly, if you're in a rural area, hours away. Uh, and that is very much a frequent thing. And, danger is here now. You can't wait for the police. You can't wait for them to come in and save you in 2 seconds. Because, unfortunately, for half of this country, if not more, that is not quite the solution. So you have to pretty much decide, am I going to utilize a tool, a firearm, to protect myself, my family, and or to kind of keep the criminal at bay while the police arrive. So I'll talk to you why stricter gun laws are not only ineffective, but also dangerous to our safety and freedom, in my opinion. And I have reviewed, obviously, national data and testimony, and of course I did my own survey. I actually had you fill out that survey. You're one of those survey respondents. So we're going to use that a little bit as some background evidence to provide talking points. So, I mean, this issue affects everyone. It affects your safety, your rights, and your family security. And it really is something that is at the helm of the political landscape in this country, quite frankly. So many, believe it's a fundamental right to own the firearm. Some people believe that right intrudes on public safety and all that. So, according to my survey, 81% of respondents agree that the right to own and carry firearms is a fundamental right for personal self-defense and public safety. Of course, that's through my personal survey. This isn't a nationally done survey. But yeah, 81% respondents, which is quite a lot for my small survey of 50 people. So first, we're going to explain the stricter gun laws fail to reduce crime. Second, I'll show you how gun ownership is essential for your self-defense and your liberty. And then third, I'll address the common arguments for gun control and why they do fall short. So, number one, stricter gun laws fail to reduce crime. Over the past 3 decades, violent crime rates in the U.S. have dropped by more than half, even as private gun ownership has doubled. This is sourced from the NRA-ILA of 2024. So, and this is going to another point in my survey. 36% of my survey respondents support strengthening gun laws, while 45% disagree with stricter gun laws, and they believe that those are not necessary to prevent mass shootings. This is sourced from my own survey results. Cities with the strictest gun control, like Chicago, often have some of the highest crime rates, showing that criminals don't follow laws. And gun control doesn't stop violence. This is sourced from Buckeye Firearms Association. I mean, we hear that all the time. The major cities are going to have, the highest crime rates. And then we go and look at how these major cities always have these anti-gun legislation installed, because cities tend to be a lot more progressive, and progressives tend to be more anti-gun. But once again, these cities do have some of the highest crime rates. We know Baltimore, Chicago, Memphis kind of be one of them. And it is a pattern. Pattern recognition kind of tells a story sometimes for certain people. So clearly, stricter laws don't quite stop crime. They may make it harder for law-abiding citizens to, only protect themselves, but also to rely on, like I said earlier, police that may not always show up very, very steadfast. So, next point, gun ownership is essential for self-defense and liberty. So, 81%, as I said earlier, of my response agree that gun ownership is a fundamental right for self-defense and public safety. You're far more likely to survive a violent assault if you defend yourself with a gun. In fact, injury rates for gun defenders are much lower than those who do nothing or use other means like, police or fleeing the scene sometimes, unfortunately. This is sourced from Buckeye Firearms Association. In the 1966 Texas Tower shooting, armed citizens helped police stop the shooting and even saved lives. This is sourced from CRPA 2022. Next support is going to be the Second Amendment was designed not just for home defense, but as a safeguard against tyranny and to ensure citizens' ability to protect themselves from all threats, domestic or even foreign. This is sourced from the NRA-ILA 2024. So, restrictive gun laws are unconstitutional, as we know. We see different various states across the country passing bans, assault weapons bans, or even bans on firearm parts. Of course, we have the ATF and other National Firearms Association, or NRA stuff, going through the ban things like vertical foregrips for short-barreled rifles and all that. It's just unconstitutional, quite frankly. Some of them don't make sense. And law-abiding citizens are the ones who have to go through this. It isn't criminals. Criminals don't care if one part of a firearm is banned or not. They don't care. Criminals are criminals. They're going to break the law regardless. And guns in the good hands of good people trained with firearms, which is something that people should be pushed more when entering the firearms community or the 2A community, is learning to train and utilize the firearm safely and properly. But people who are trained with firearms, police or not, law enforcement or not, are deterrents to violent criminals and gun crimes. So, the right to bear arms is not just a tradition, it's necessary for safety and freedom. So next we'll get into my counter-arguments, the addressing arguments for gun control. So, 54% of gun deaths are unfortunately suicides. It is heartbreaking to know. The fact that someone would take their life at all is heartbreaking, but studies show the absence of firearms are not really changing much of the suicide rates. And even in countries like Japan, South Korea, China, East Asia, really, where gun ownership is null, or pretty much zero, they have higher suicide rates. People could argue that's due to culture, overworking, etc. But in America, where guns are, much simpler to get compared to Japan, suicide is lower. And that's sourced from the CDC of 2023 and the CRPA of 2022. So-called assault weapons, these are AR-15s, AK-47 type rifles, and more. They're used in less than 1% of homicides. And banning them does little to address the real cause of violence. And that's sourced from Buckeye Firearms. We see that in states like Illinois, Washington State just kind of did something like that. Colorado's passed something like that. Banning assault weapons, like these rifles, really doesn't do much, because the vast majority of gun crime is done with handguns. But rifles and assault weapons, as they're called, tend to take the helm of the anti-gun masses. So that's something interesting to note. And even in countries with strict gun laws, criminals still find ways to use guns or other types of weapons to commit violence. For example, in the United Kingdom, gun-related crime has risen in recent years as criminals have turned to black markets and or 3D printed firearms despite strict bans. the UK has some of the strictest bans in the world, and this is sourced from BBC News. So if the UK is going through it, and they're still somehow getting guns, why would it be much different here? So next, many pro-gun advocates support enforcing existing laws, mandatory training, and responsible ownership, rather than punishing law-abiding citizens with new restrictions. This is sourced from NRA-ILA 2024. And back to my survey results, 85% of respondents in their households have owned or used a firearm, showing that responsible gun ownership is the norm, not the exception. And arguments for stricter laws often ignore facts and punish the responsible majority. People like you and me, Max. So it really is unfortunate. Now, to recap my main points, stricter gun laws do not reduce crime. Gun ownership is vital for self-defense and liberty, and arguments for more restrictions do not hold up to scrutiny or statistics, as mentioned with other countries and even crimes and criminals, utilizing firearms regardless of bans or not. And a society that values freedom must trust its citizens with the means to defend themselves and even others. It is an American culture to own a firearm or to utilize it when necessary, maybe for protecting the nation, protecting yourself, your family, your land, etc. It is as American as you could imagine, and it is unfortunate that it's become such a helm of political issues. We have nations out there with massive amounts of gun freedoms, like Switzerland, Thailand, and they have very low crime rates. Sometimes it's not always the firearm, but it's maybe a cultural issue or something else that's causing these crime rates to occur. So, yeah, that was my speech for anti-gun laws. Do you have any thoughts, Max?
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a lot of interesting points.
Yeah.
No. Uh, a few things. I mean, in terms of the legalities, you brought up, you know, firearm safety is important.
Mm.
I think from a legislative standpoint, someone who hasn't owned a gun before should have a compulsory firearms training course. I know I'm from Maryland, and when you buy, essentially, it's any gun with a barrel under 16 inches. When you want to buy one, you need to get licensed, and part of that
Yeah.
licensure is you have to go and take a firearms safety and training course. And usually it's somebody from who's a firearms expert or somebody from like the state police who's training the course. I see the value in legislation like that because there are a lot of firearms related accidents as a
Yeah.
result of safety issues. Um, and interestingly, you brought up other countries like Switzerland. Switzerland, I believe, has compulsory military service, and that's one of the reasons why there's that firearms culture there in that country, and it's a very homogenized population.
Yeah. They also have
It's a
mandatory military training, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's mandatory military service, and that's why there's that firearms culture in Switzerland. It's a homogenized population. They don't have the socioeconomic distribution that we have here in America, and I don't have any statistics readily available, but there is data to support, socioeconomic factors as it
Hmm.
correlates with, firearm-related crime.
Oh, yeah.
Um, but
And then that goes back
yeah,
to point is that sometimes it's more socioeconomic and cultural as compared to just firearm readily being available. But the idea of having people go through a training course is really honestly
Mhm.
one of the few aspects of the opposition talking points that I personally would probably agree with. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, absolutely makes sense. To me, it is for sure a more socioeconomic and cultural issue in America, particularly because as you brought up, Switzerland is not only a homogenized nation, it is also like you said, or mandatory training firearms, and they also have conscription there, if I'm correct. So
Yep.
it makes sense why, of course, their culture is much more on firearm safety, and almost I believe every person who's been conscripted for mandatory service in Switzerland, I believe they get to keep their firearm or at least buy it back when they're out of service. So that helps increase that gun ownership culture in Switzerland. So yeah, it definitely brings back to some stuff I was talking about earlier, how it might not be the firearm, but rather cultural or socioeconomic reasons in America, particular, that we see this crime and this unfortunate happenings. And of course, our suicide rate is way too high. So unfortunately, I don't see suicide rates dropping too much, because you could argue that goes into socioeconomic reasons why people do that, or personal
Mental
reasons.
health.
Exact mental health epidemic is so bad. And unfortunately, if
Uh,
someone wants to commit suicide, they are probably more likely to do it regardless of a firearm being accessible or not. There's probably easier ways to do it. Unfortunately, it's just heartbreaking. I mean, like I said earlier, in Japan and East Asia, they they find ways, and their suicide rates are much larger, and it's really sad. But yeah, I like that point you brought up. Mandatory or at least encouraged training with firearms. The 2A community does that a lot. They urge people, especially new gun owners, to actually go and properly train and or learn the intricate matter of firearms and how to properly and safely use them. And of course, you have range officers. You know this. You're a gun owner. So it is good to see that the 2A community is trying to urge responsible gun ownership in America, and that's definitely became a lot more of a commonplace thing. But yeah, well, do you have any other thoughts, or?
no, I don't think so. Um, yeah, a lot of good points. Learned a lot of new things about, um, firearms in this country and
Yeah,
actually around the world, and sort of how it correlates with crime.
yeah. I mean, as a final talking point or just a final point, it really is just something people cannot exactly pinpoint down in the United States as a whole. People argue, oh, it's racial matters or it's economic matters. I personally think it's more economic, socioeconomic reasons. Mental health is another great one. But why are people so mentally ill in this country? Why are the rates exploding? Why are people, frankly, more sad? And it's just, there's so many reasons for the crime we see, and it is pretty damn difficult to exactly dial it down. So, yeah, well, I'll leave it off there. Thank you, Max, for being my listener, and especially giving your points. That was really, really wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Max.